Andy Burnham once promised to end rough sleeping in Greater Manchester by 2020. He missed that target, said so publicly, and kept the job anyway. Now he has made the same promise again, this time from the steps of Downing Street, with the whole country watching instead of one city region. That single fact tells you almost everything about the government he has just built. Not the slogans from his first speech as prime minister, not the warm words about a new political model and a new economic model. The appointments, who got a department, who got shown the door, who was kept on despite being loyal to the man Burnham just replaced, and why, within hours of entering number 10, Burnham had scrapped VAT on domestic electricity bills, visited a homelessness charity in Victoria, and reshuffled a cabinet that removed a former chancellor, a former foreign secretary, and a former business secretary in one sitting. 3 days earlier, Rachel Reeves, David Lammy, and Peter Kyle had been running some of the largest departments in government. By the weekend, they had no government job at all. This is a story about what happens when a party finally hands power to the man it kept saying no to for a decade. It is also a story about the gap between what a politician says he stands for and what he actually does once the phones start ringing and the department needs a name attached to it by 5 o'clock. Burnham's cabinet answers three questions that matter far more than any speech. How loyal does he intend to be to the people who got him here? How much does he actually trust his own team? And can a man who never fully solved rough sleeping in one city plausibly solve it in an entire country? Read to understand any new government, you do not read the speech. You read the list. A cabinet reshuffle is the most honest document a prime minister ever produces because it forces choices that a stump speech never has to make. Every appointment is a decision to trust one person over another, to reward one wing of the party over another, to bet a department's future on someone Burnham has worked with before or someone new entirely. By the end of this video, you will understand why Ed Miliband walked away from a 10-year project he built from nothing to take a job that has nothing to do with it. You will understand why John Healey, a man who quit the last government in a very public row over money, is now the one deciding how the money gets spent. You will understand why Angela Rayner is back in cabinet after resigning in disgrace and later being cleared, and why that story matters more than most people realize. And you will understand what all of this tells you about whether Burnham can actually deliver on the pledge he keeps making and keeps missing, getting people off the streets. None of this is abstract. If you pay a household energy bill in Britain, if you have ever worried about the cost of rent, if you have ever stepped past someone sleeping in a doorway and felt the particular discomfort of not knowing what to do about it, this cabinet is now making decisions that reach you directly. Understanding who is making those decisions and why they were chosen is the difference between watching politics happen to you and understanding it well enough to hold it to account. Main Badia government built in a hurry, Burnham became Britain's seventh prime minister in a decade after Keir Starmer's position collapsed under the weight of a leadership crisis that had been building for months. Starmer's popularity had fallen steadily since Labour's 2024 election win, and the fallout from the Peter Mandelson ambassador appointment made, despite Mandelson's documented ties to the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, hardened opposition to Starmer inside his own party. By May 2026, that opposition had produced resignations from within his own cabinet. By July, Starmer was gone, and Burnham, who had spent years as mayor of Greater Manchester, positioning himself as the northern alternative to a leadership he often criticized as too London-focused, had the job he had wanted for a very long time. There is a temptation to treat a change of prime minister inside the same governing party as a minor event, a change of face rather than a change of direction. The cabinet Burnham assembled in his first days argues against that reading. He did not inherit Starmer's top team and make a few tweaks around the edges. He took an axe to it. Rachel Reeves, who had held the second most powerful job in government as chancellor, was out. David Lammy, who had risen to deputy prime minister and had previously served as foreign secretary, was out. Peter Kyle, who ran the business department, was out. These were not marginal figures. These were three of the people who had defined what a Starmer government looked like, and Burnham removed all three in his opening move. Lammy's departure was notable for how he handled it. He did not attack Burnham on the way out. He posted that serving in Starmer's cabinet had been the greatest privilege of his life, said he would have been proud to continue, and then added something worth sitting with. A new prime minister is entitled to build his own team, and Starmer had shown him loyalty by appointing him, so he made no apology for returning that loyalty by going quietly. It is the kind of statement that reads as gracious on the surface and underneath functions as a quiet marker being laid down. Lammy was signaling where his loyalty sits, and it is not with the man who just fired him. That is the story worth understanding before any individual appointment. This was not a reshuffle in the ordinary sense, where a prime minister moves people between departments to freshen things up while keeping the broad coalition intact. This was a change of regime inside the same party, and Burnham used it the way regimes usually use their first weeks, to remove the previous leader's people from the rooms where decisions get made and to replace them with people he already trusts. The purge, and what it says about how Burnham intends to govern every incoming prime minister, faces the same basic dilemma. Do you bring in people who are loyal to you personally, people who have proven themselves in the fight to get you into the job, or do you try to hold the wider party together by keeping some of your predecessors' allies in place, signaling continuity and discouraging any sense that this is a factional takeover? Burnham chose the first option and chose it decisively. Look at who filled the gaps left by Reeves, Lammy, and Kyle, and a clear pattern appears. John Healey, the new chancellor, is someone Burnham has known since the Blair and Brown years, a frontbench veteran who served in Ed Miliband's shadow cabinet and Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet before becoming Starmer's defense secretary. Healey's own resignation from that job in a row over defense spending was one of the moments that accelerated Starmer's decline. A source inside Burnham's operation described Healey's appointment plainly. He is trusted, experienced, and shares the new prime minister's outlook. That is not a coded message. That is the whole message. Then there is Louise Hay, given the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster role and named First Secretary of State, effectively Burnham's number two inside government. Hay was not a peripheral figure in Burnham's rise. She was described as part of a group of Northern power women who helped run his by-election campaign in Makerfield, the seat he needed to win to re-enter Parliament and make a leadership bid possible in the first place. She had previously resigned from Starmer's cabinet as Transport Secretary over a historic offense relating to a stolen work phone and had been openly critical of what she called a boys' club culture inside Starmer's Downing Street operation. Putting her at the center of Whitehall, running the cabinet office and driving Burnham's devolution and cost of living agenda is as clear a statement of trust as a prime minister can make. Wes Streeting's position deserves particular attention because it complicates the simple story of a loyalty purge. Streeting was widely seen as Burnham's most credible rival for the leadership. He spent weeks insisting he had the 81 backers needed to mount his own bid before ruling himself out. A prime minister who wanted total control of the narrative might have sidelined a defeated rival entirely or handed him a department with little influence. Instead, Burnham made Streeting Defense Secretary, one of the great offices of state in all but name, a department now handling some of the most consequential decisions in government. That single choice tells you Burnham is not simply rewarding personal loyalty. He is also trying to build a government wide enough to hold, bringing a serious rival inside the tent rather than leaving him outside it with a grievance and a following. Contrast that with Yvette Cooper's move. Cooper had been one of the most senior figures in Starmer's government, serving first as Home Secretary and then as Foreign Secretary, one of the four great offices of state. Under Burnham, she becomes Health and Social Care Secretary. Some Westminster observers reasonably read this as a demotion, even though the department she now runs sits at the center of Burnham's stated priorities. Cooper served alongside Burnham in the Blair and Brown governments decades ago, then spent time on the backbenches during the Corbyn years before returning under Starmer. Her repositioning under Burnham is not a purge. She was not removed, but she has been moved from the most prestigious foreign-facing job in government into a department defined by long-term, thankless, unglamorous reform. Whether that reflects Burnham's priorities or a quieter recalibration of who sits closest to him is something worth watching over the coming months. The pattern across all of this is not chaos. It has a clear internal logic. Burnham has kept people whose skills he specifically needs, brought in people whose personal loyalty is proven, absorbed one serious rival rather than exile him, and moved others sideways without removing them outright. It is the cabinet of a man who understands that surviving as prime minister for more than a few months requires more than a base of true believers. It requires enough of the wider party inside the government that no faction feels locked out completely. Whether that balance holds is a separate question. Burnham himself, within days of forming this cabinet, publicly admitted he was concerned about the balance after a separate personnel question came up and said the party needed a wider conversation about how it manages itself internally. That is an unusually candid thing for a sitting prime minister to say about his own top team within his first weeks in office. It suggests Burnham knows the balancing act he has attempted is not yet finished business. Why Ed Miliband walked away from net zero of every appointment in this cabinet, Ed Miliband's move from Energy Secretary to Foreign Secretary is the hardest to explain with a simple story, and the most revealing once you look closely. Miliband had spent the years since Labour's 2024 election win building what amounted to a decade-long project. As Energy Secretary, he set ambitious net zero targets and pushed an aggressive program of green energy investment, staking a significant part of his political identity on seeing that agenda through to completion. This was not a job he was filling in for a while before moving on. It was the role he had chosen to define the second act of his career after his own turn as Labour leader ended in defeat a decade earlier, and yet offered the chance to become Britain's chief diplomat. He took it. Part of the explanation is straightforward opportunity. Foreign Secretary is a great office of state. Energy Secretary, however significant the portfolio, is not. Miliband had reportedly been in contention for Chancellor itself, arguably an even bigger prize, but that job went to Healey instead. Foreign Secretary was the next best thing on offer, and turning down one of the four great offices of state to keep running a single departmental brief, however personally important that brief had become to him, is a difficult thing for any politician to justify to themselves. But there is a more specific reason Miliband was the right fit for this particular job, and it says something about how Burnham is thinking about foreign policy under his premiership. A source close to Burnham said Miliband was chosen for his experience negotiating with governments around the world during his time running the energy brief. Climate diplomacy in the last decade has effectively been a form of international relations in its own right, securing international agreements on emissions targets, coordinating with other governments on green investment, negotiating with countries whose economies depend on fossil fuel exports. All of that is a version of diplomacy that happens to be conducted through the lens of energy policy rather than through embassies and summits. Miliband has been doing a form of the foreign secretary's job for years without holding the title. There is also a signal buried in this appointment about how much time Burnham intends to spend on the world stage himself. Burnham has said directly that he intends to spend less time on foreign visits than Starmer did. That is a meaningful thing for an incoming prime minister to say out loud. Foreign policy is usually where prime ministers most want personal visibility, the summits, the state visits, the photographs beside other world leaders. Burnham signaling he wants less of that suggests he sees his own political capital as better spent on domestic delivery, on the cost of living questions and the housing crisis, and the rough sleeping pledge he keeps making. If that is the plan, then handing the Foreign Office to someone as experienced and internationally credible as Miliband and trusting him to run it with a relatively free hand makes far more sense. Burnham is not simply promoting an ally. He may be delegating an entire dimension of government to someone he trusts to handle it without him, freeing himself to focus on the domestic agenda he has built his political identity around. None of this fully answers what happens to the net zero project Miliband is leaving behind. That work now falls to Miata van Bulle, the new energy secretary, a member of Burnham's inner circle who resigned as a housing minister earlier this year, specifically in protest at Starmer's leadership, and has spent the months since advising Burnham directly. She inherits a genuinely difficult brief. Net zero commitments do not pause because the person who championed them changed jobs, and continuity of ambition on climate policy without the individual who spent years building relationships and credibility on that exact issue is one of the quieter risks buried inside this reshuffle. Von Bulle's proximity to Burnham suggests she has his confidence. Whether she has the same standing internationally that Miliband built over years is something that will only become clear over time. The chancellor who quit over money now controls the money. If there is one appointment that carries the most immediate consequence for people watching this video, it is John Healey becoming chancellor. The irony here is hard to miss. Healey's resignation from Starmer's cabinet as defense secretary came after a dispute specifically about increasing defense spending. That resignation was one of the significant moments that weakened Starmer's position in the run up to his eventual departure. A man who left government fighting about how much money the state should spend on defense has now been handed control of the entire Treasury. There are two ways to read this. The first is that Burnham wanted a chancellor whose instincts on public spending he already understood in detail, someone who had shown, through the act of resigning rather than backing down, that he holds firm positions and is willing to act on them. That is a useful quality in a chancellor if you want someone who will push back honestly rather than simply implement whatever the prime minister wants to hear. The second reading is more pointed. Burnham has just scrapped VAT on domestic electricity bills as his first policy act, a move that costs the Treasury real revenue at a moment when the public finances are already under pressure, putting Healey in charge of finding the money for that. And for the cost of living agenda Burnham has promised more broadly, hands the hardest arithmetic in government to someone whose last public act in office was arguing that not enough money was being spent in a different direction entirely. Both readings can be true at once. Burnham may genuinely trust Healey's judgment and also be setting him an extraordinarily difficult task. The electricity VAT cut is popular. It is also expensive, and it is the first item on a long list of promises this government has made in its opening days, alongside ending rough sleeping nationally and delivering what Burnham called a new economic model. Somebody has to make those numbers work or explain honestly why they cannot. That job now belongs to a man who quit his last cabinet post rather than accept a number he disagreed with. Rayner's return, and what it says about how far loyalty stretches few appointments in this cabinet carry more history than Angela Rayner's return as housing secretary. Rayner resigned from Starmer's cabinet and from her role as deputy prime minister and deputy labor leader after questions were raised about her tax affairs, specifically around underpaying stamp duty. She was later cleared of wrongdoing by HMRC. That sequence, resignation under a cloud, followed by full clearance, is one of the more uncomfortable stories in recent British politics because it raises a question that rarely gets a satisfying answer. What does a politician do with the months or years lost to a scandal that turns out in the end not to have been a scandal at all? Rayner's answer, it seems, was to keep working. She was seen meeting Burnham in Greater Manchester earlier this year, a meeting widely read at the time as a signal of her support for his leadership bid. That support has now been repaid with one of the most consequential domestic departments in government. Housing sits at the center of almost every problem this cabinet has been assembled to address. The cost of living crisis Burnham keeps referencing is in large part a housing crisis. The rough sleeping pledge depends heavily on housing supply and housing policy. Rayner, a self described socialist who built her political identity on workers' rights, now has direct control over the department that will make or break several of Burnham's central promises. There is something worth noting in the fact that Burnham chose to rehabilitate Rayner so completely and so quickly, rather than quietly leaving her on the backbenches even after her clearance. It suggests Burnham's loyalty test is not simply about who stayed clean throughout their career. It is about who backed him when it counted and who he believes can do the job now. That is a more forgiving standard than some previous governments have applied. And it may serve Burnham well if it encourages people to take risks on his behalf, knowing that a setback does not necessarily mean permanent exile. It may also store up risk if voters read Rayner's return as evidence that consequences in this government are negotiable for the right ally at the right moment, the ones who stayed and the ones who were quietly demoted without being fired. Not every story in this cabinet is about loyalty rewarded or disloyalty punished. Some of the more interesting decisions are about who Burnham simply left in place and what that tells you about pragmatism winning out over factional politics. Shabana Mahmood remains Home Secretary, a job she took on after previously serving as Justice Secretary. She has led the government's push for stricter migration controls, work that has reportedly helped reduce channel crossings, and she now faces a delicate internal fight because backbench Labour MPs who want those migration curbs softened are likely to see Burnham's premiership as an opportunity to push back. Keeping Mahmood in place rather than replacing her with someone more sympathetic to that backbench pressure suggests Burnham intends to hold a firmer line on migration than some of his own supporters might expect from a leader who has often positioned himself to the left of the party establishment. Pat McFadden stays on at work and pensions, overseeing welfare spending and the state pension. Despite being widely seen as one of Starmer's most loyal lieutenants, at times even described as the real deputy prime minister during his time running the cabinet office. His survival is a useful data point against the theory that this cabinet is a simple purge of anyone connected to Starmer. Continuity and competence in some departments appear to have mattered more to Burnham than factional history. Lisa Nandy keeps her job as culture secretary, and her position is worth noting for a different reason. Her Greater Manchester constituency of Wigan borders Burnham's own seat of Makerfield, and she was something of an outsider in Starmer's cabinet, having previously run against him for the Labour leadership and finished third. Her survival under Burnham, alongside her geographic and political closeness to him, fits the broader pattern of the new prime minister favoring people with northern roots and long personal history with him over the London-centered political class he has criticized in the past. Bridget Phillipson's move is one of the more understated demotions in this reshuffle. She loses Education Secretary, a significant department, but keeps her seat at Cabinet as the Minister for Women and Equalities, a role in which she had already been overseeing contested changes to Equality and Human Rights Commission guidance on trans people. Phillipson is a close Starmer ally, and losing her larger department while being kept on in a smaller one is the softer version of what happened decisively to Reeves, Lammy, and Kyle. She was not purged. She was quietly reduced. Can Burnham actually end rough sleeping, this time on a national scale? This is the question that matters most because it is the one Burnham has already answered wrong once. In 2017, newly elected as mayor of Greater Manchester, Burnham pledged to end rough sleeping in the region by 2020. He set up a homelessness fund to which he committed 15% of his own salary, and in 2018 launched the flagship A Bed Every Night scheme, the first initiative of its kind run by any city in the country, guaranteeing shelter, warmth, and support to anyone sleeping rough across all 10 boroughs of Greater Manchester. The results were real, and they were also incomplete. Numbers fell from a peak of 268 people counted sleeping rough on a single night in 2017 down to a low of around 89 or 90 in 2021, helped significantly by the national pandemic era, everyone in policy working alongside Burnham's own scheme. A related program called Housing First, which places people directly into permanent homes with ongoing support rather than requiring sobriety or compliance first, supported 426 people since its 2019 launch, with roughly 78% of them still housed 18 months later. Those are genuinely strong outcome for a group of people who often carry some of the most complex needs in the entire welfare system. But the trajectory has since reversed and reversed sharply. Rough sleeping in Greater Manchester rose for 4 consecutive years, reaching 197 in the official autumn 2025 count, more than double the 2021 low and edging back toward the 268 figure recorded when Burnham first took office. Nationally, the picture is worse. England's rough sleeping count hit a record high of 793 people in autumn 2025, up from a low of 2,143 in 2021. Burnham missed his original 2020 target and said so publicly at the time. He now faces the same test at a scale roughly 20 times larger, with none of the direct local control over housing benefit rules, asylum accommodation policy, or local housing allowance rates that sit at national level entirely in his own government's hands rather than someone else's. His own explanation for the rise under his mayoralty, offered during a visit to a homelessness charity in London hours before his first speech as Prime Minister, is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as spin. He pointed to frozen local housing allowance rates, rising evictions from asylum accommodation, and unmet health and social care needs, all factors set by national policy rather than anything a metro mayor controls. He also made a specific observation from his time running a bed every night. Manchester was for years the only place in the country running a scheme at that scale, which meant people experiencing homelessness elsewhere were drawn toward the city because the support existed there and nowhere else. His conclusion was that the approach only works if it happens everywhere at once, coordinated nationally rather than as one city carrying the weight alone. That is precisely the argument for why a national version of his approach, run from Downing Street with control over the levers he never had as mayor, might succeed where the Manchester version plateaued. It is also conveniently an argument that shifts a meaningful share of the blame away from his own record and onto factors he can now claim credit for fixing. Critics have not let that pass unchallenged. The shadow housing secretary has pointed out there is limited detail on how a national rough sleeping pledge would actually be funded and questioned whether other spending will need to be quietly redirected to pay for it. A senior figure from Reform UK went further, suggesting Burnham is not the person he would call first for advice on solving rough sleeping, given his own record as mayor. Both critiques land somewhere close to the truth, and both miss something too. Burnham's Manchester record is genuinely mixed. Real measurable success followed by a real measurable reversal driven substantially by forces outside his control. That does not prove he can succeed nationally. It does not prove he cannot either. What it proves is that the tools he built in Manchester, the emergency bed provision, the housing first model, the direct personal financial commitment, actually work when they are resourced properly and not undermined by national policy pulling in the opposite direction. The honest answer to whether Burnham can end rough sleeping as prime minister is that nobody knows yet, including Burnham. What is knowable right now is whether the government he has just built contains people capable of delivering it. Rayner controls housing, Healey controls the money, Cooper now runs health and social care. Another piece of the puzzle, Burnham himself identified as central. For the first time, the person who designed a bed every night also controls the national purse strings, the National Housing Department, and the National Health and Social Care brief simultaneously. If this fails now, it will not be for lack of institutional reach. It will be because the problem is harder than any single government, however aligned, can solve inside one term. There is a version of this story that treats a cabinet reshuffle as court gossip, a list of winners and losers to be forgotten within a week. That version misses what actually happened here. Burnham did not simply promote his friends. He built a specific kind of government, one where the people closest to him personally now sit directly on top of the departments that will decide whether his central promise, the one he has made twice now and kept only partially the first time, succeeds or fails. That is either the most coherent thing a new prime minister has done in years, or it is a serious concentration of risk, all resting on people whose personal loyalty to Burnham is beyond question, but whose collective ability to solve a problem that has resisted every government for a decade is still entirely unproven. Miliband walked away from a project he spent years building because a bigger office was offered and because Burnham trusted him to represent the country without needing to be present himself. Healey took the Treasury after quitting his last job over a spending argument. Rayner returned to frontline politics carrying the scar tissue of a scandal that turned out to be nothing, trusted anyway because she showed up when it mattered. None of these are safe, predictable choices. They are bets placed by a man who spent a decade waiting for exactly this chance and clearly intends to spend it building a government in his own image rather than managing a cautious continuation of what came before. The test now has nothing to do with speeches, first day announcements, or how convincingly anyone explains their reasoning on camera. It has to do with whether a person still sleeping outside a shop doorway in Manchester or Newcastle or Bristol has a different life 18 months from now than they do tonight. Burnham built the tools to answer that question once already in one city and watched the numbers slide backward once the wind changed direction. Whether he has learned enough from that experience to hold the line this time, with the whole machinery of national government behind him instead of one mayoralty, is the only appointment in this cabinet that will actually be judged by people who never read a single headline about who got which job. If you found this breakdown useful, consider subscribing for more analysis like this as Burnham's government takes shape. And here is one worth answering in the comments. Do you think a prime minister who could not fully solve rough sleeping in one city, even with real effort and real investment behind him, can plausibly solve it across an entire country? Leave your answer below. This video is an independent analysis of publicly reported political events based on reporting from named news organizations at the time of publication. It is not affiliated with Andy Burnham, his office, the Labour Party, or any government department. The content presented is offered for informational and educational purposes and does not constitute political, financial, or professional advice. Political situations evolve quickly. Viewers are encouraged to consult current primary reporting before drawing final conclusions.